Today is a pretty exciting day, as it typically is when getting the chance to play around with new paint. It all started when I came across this watercolor paint set, this Galaxy watercolor paint set. I'm sure it's a surprise to no one that my interest was immediately piqued. So I decided to look more into this specific type of watercolor paint because I hadn't actually heard of it before. These are the Schmincke Super Granulation paints. The name seems to be quite self-explanatory. It suggests that these paints have intense granulating properties, but what it fails to mention is just how many of these paints have that color split or color shift thing going on with them. Think Daniel Smith's Moonglow, easily one of the most well-known watercolor paints. So from that, I was sold. I knew I had to try these paints out, even if my self-restraint had already dwindled due to the Galaxy aspect. So here are the colors I bought. The first was, of course, the Galaxy set, which all of these colors seem to be split into specific categories. So you have the Galaxy set, there's Deep Sea, Glacier, a lot of different things. So for individual tubes, I also picked up Desert Green and Desert Gray, Deep Sea Green and Deep Sea Indigo, and finally Tundra Violet and Tundra Pink. The first thing was to get some of each paint color into pans. That's just my preferred way of organizing and using watercolor paint. I label one of the short ends of the pans with some sort of designation as to the brand. So for this, I just put an SSG for Schmincke Super Granulation, and then on one of the longer sides, actually write the color. That way, if I need to refill the pan later on, I know exactly what color it is without having to guess and try and figure it out. I also just wanted to point out and mention, even with the smaller 5ml tubes, I probably only used about half of the tube to fill up an entire pan. And here's what all the colors looked like in pans. So I let those sit for about 24 hours. They weren't completely dry, but I figured they were dry enough to have me start messing around with them and actually swatching them. I decided to grab one of my favorite watercolor papers to do these swatches on, which is the Winsor Newton Professional paper. And the names are actually really closely tied to the color sets that they're in, so the color names are pretty basic combinations of the line and actual shade. So you'll have things like Galaxy Violet and Tundra Violet, or Galaxy Black and Glacier Black, things like that. And so because of that, that is why I laid out my swatch sheet like this. I just figured it made more sense to put them in like their category groups and try and figure out like the color order of them all, especially since so many of these have such extreme like color splitting properties. It was going to be a nightmare to trying to figure out what order they were going to be in. I did just want to say though that this swatch chart really, I don't think it did the paint colors justice. I could tell when I was doing it that these paints really needed more room to like spread out and really do their like color splitting thing. There were definitely a few that did that still because it was like so intense, but I just could tell when I was working on it that they really were paints that needed to spread out more than this swatching session was allowing. But regardless, here is how all of the swatches it turned out. But because these swatches were a bit disappointing, I knew I had to put these to the test. So in honor of there being so many Galaxy themed paints, I decided to draw up this spacey Galaxy sort of landscape painting to work on. I also wanted to come up with something that could use as many of the paint colors as possible in it. So I think I ended up getting 6 out of the 11 colors that I bought into this. Right now this is a lot of the Galaxy Pink and Galaxy Violet, but I also ended up adding in some of the Galaxy Brown, Black, as well as a Tundra Pink and Tundra Violet. And I'm sure you can tell even just from this initial first super rough layer just how much these colors are splitting more, especially in that like left cloud section. That is the Tundra Violet. It has this really cool like orangey brown that ends up coming out, and I also think mixing the colors together really helps them separate more and just creates a super interesting look and texture. Because I know from the swatches, a lot of them looked super underwhelming. Within the Galaxy set, I ended up buying the set because when I was looking up swatches online, I was interested in at least 2 of the colors, and like these tubes are incredibly expensive. The 15ml ones are 30 Canadian dollars, and the Galaxy set of 5 colors, even though they were 5ml, it was like 55 or something along the lines. And so even if I was interested in like 2 of the 3 colors, it was going to be the same price or actually cheaper to just buy the Galaxy set and get less of the paint, but be able to try out more of the colors. So for this painting, I really wanted to try and use only the super granulating paints, even though in reality, I probably would not exclusively use them for a painting. I was really looking at these for me to like have them around to use as like accent paints, or, you know, when I really want that interesting separating look as part of a painting, then to use one or, you know, a couple of the colors. So this was possibly a slightly impractical use of them, at least for me. Maybe not impractical, but this is not necessarily how I'm planning on using them in the future. And because I was trying to only use these paints, I ended up doing a ton of layers to try and build up that depth that you need when drawing like dark outer space. Because I will say, as a connoisseur of watercolor galaxy painting, the box art on the galaxy paints is kind of underwhelming. Or at the very least, it's not my personal taste in galaxy painting. But anyway, back to this painting that I'm working on. I tried to keep in as much of the painting footage as I could and still have it be, you know, interesting and not boring and literally having you watch paint dry, so that you could really see how the paint reacted and dried. You can probably tell right now it's quite splotchy, which is honestly what happens with any granulating paint color. It just dries like that. It likes separating so much that it just isn't, or it doesn't seem like a very pigmented paint, if that makes sense. Like, even though I'm using like basically it at its full strength, it's just not as dark as you would think it would dry as, which that could just be me having a weird painting day too. But that is why you see me adding so many layers to build up that depth. And also, I think it's also this paper, because this paper does really love to lift color, so I probably should have thought of that when using extremely granulating paints on a paper that likes lifting up colors. But when I would add paint on top, especially in like the sky galaxy section, it did really like reactivating underneath, and so that also didn't help my situation. But that's also me like trying to force these paints to do something that, in my opinion, they weren't necessarily made to do. Like, I would not try and normally paint an entire galaxy painting with the super granulating paints. I think especially with like the Tundra Violet and the Galaxy Violet, they have such a cool split that adding those into the lighter areas and having them do their thing, like you can see here, that incredible section behind the planet, like at the top, there is no way that anything other than these paints could create that split and just incredibly interesting cloud formations of color. So overall, I am really happy with these paints. I think knowing when is the right time to use them is definitely going to help your situation. For me, that's like a special occasional paint, which to some people that might seem like a waste, but really that whole section, like I said, above the planet, it just looks so cool, and I think it does come off on camera as well as it does in person, but just things like that is really what makes these paints special. The price tag does slightly kill me though. I wish that you could buy the 5ml tubes individually, because I definitely would have gone for those as opposed to the 15ml, because I'm going to have this paint forever at this rate. The standouts of the ones that I really got a chance to play around with were the Galaxy Violet and the Tundra Violet. They have some of the most incredible color splitting properties amongst them. So if you're wanting to try out one or a couple of these paint colors, then that might be somewhere to start. But that is going to be everything for this video. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one.